Right. So it's Friday at 4 o'clock. We didn't think we'd be here today, but we got some big news. But let's start with our school spirit today, which is the Harlan County Public Schools. We appreciate them making sure that all of their students are safe, both at home and when they get back to in-person classes. Harlan County is a special place where I have a lot of friends. They've got a lot going on there, a great public school system. We appreciate that mask. All right, so today I am very excited to be standing here with our Secretary of State, Michael Adams, to announce that we have reached an agreement on how to conduct the general election. Let me say that I don't really think that this was too much of a negotiation going back and forth. I think we both wanted a successful election where we could protect people's health and get what we believe will be one of the larger turnouts we've seen because there are so many options to vote. I want to make sure that I acknowledge that our Secretary of State came with a very good starting plan. We were only negotiating some of the finer points, and I want to commend him for putting, at least what I believe is putting ideology on the shelf to make sure that we have an election that both stresses health and enfranchisement. So I'm really excited about today's announcement. And it shows that Democrats and Republicans can still agree on something, whether it's in Washington or here. But I believe that this agreement was easy to reach based on a relationship of trust where we both knew that we were trying to get to a good place for the voters of Kentucky. So I believe that this plan, which was based on a formal proposal by Secretary Adams that I have now signed into an executive order, creates, I believe, the most options to vote that we have seen in an election. And we just have some of the major points. I'm going to go over them, and then our Secretary of State can correct me in all the mistakes I make, which will make this like a normal 4 o'clock press conference. So the first part is absentee voting by mail. This is going to give every Kentuckian who is concerned with contracting or spreading the coronavirus the option to request an absentee ballot to vote by mail. That means that either if you are concerned about your own health or you are concerned about those that you come into contact with and spreading, you have this option. Here's an even bigger, better point. The portal to request that ballot is going to be open within 7 days. So by Friday of next week, you will already be able to request your absentee ballot that should be mailed to your home, and then we want you to complete really fast and returned. The ballots need to be postmarked by Election Day, November 3rd, but this is important. They also have to be received by November the 6th. I think this was a compromise in both wanting to know the winner of an election within a period of time and also giving people the most options they can to get that ballot in. Drop boxes. This was an idea from the Secretary of State primarily during the primary. They turned out to be very popular. People would know that their ballot was in, are going to be available for Kentuckians to return their mail ballots if they're concerned about postal delays. County clerks will determine these and set them up. So, a robust opportunity for absentee ballots by mail. Now, the portal will close on October you can give them the date, in a date in October. After that point, you can still request them by their traditional means, but this is important so the clerks can get them out because there's going to be a decent volume to everybody, and there'll be time to get them back in. Second point is early voting. The Secretary's proposal has the most robust early voting period that we've seen in Kentucky in my lifetime. So beginning the week of October 13th for 3 weeks, including 4 hours apiece, I think, on each Saturday, people in every county of Kentucky are going to be able to go in and cast their ballot early. Now, this is important for 2 reasons. One, I think more people will vote. It's more convenient. And what we've seen in this last election is people really like convenience. It's more important, I think, than party is your ability to do it. But number 2, it makes it safer. For those that want to vote in person, it makes it safer. You can pick your time. We can significantly decrease the density. And for those that want to vote in person, we highly encourage you to do it in that 3-week period before Election Day itself. I think it will also make Election Day go smoother. Election Day voting. This is another area where the recommendation, I thought, provided a very good addition to what we saw in the primary, and that's that counties that want to reduce their number of polling locations, and we expect all of them to reduce them at least some. That's what we're dealing with in the middle of COVID. We don't want the different volunteers who would be poll workers who would be in harm's way. We want to make sure that there are enough polling places, though, in other words, not just one, in Jefferson and Fayette County. So plans to reduce polling locations will have to come to the Secretary of State, to the Board of Elections, and myself to be approved. And I like this one. Every county will still have at least one voting supercenter, which is a term I think will live forever, a voting supercenter. And what that means is there's at least one location, think like the fairgrounds in Louisville, where you can go and vote, and all the ballots are available. Otherwise, you'll have to go to a location near you at least to get that correct ballot. And last, there's some voter identification pieces I want to make sure that the Secretary gets to address. I think that this is one where we saw a real willingness to be reasonable in the midst of COVID, and if you haven't been able to get that voter ID, different ways that you can either sign a statement or ultimately still vote. Again, I believe that this was definitely putting practicality, the situation we're in, and the health of Kentucky people above anything else. So I want to make sure that we hear from Secretary Adams on this great plan, and again, we were able to come to it pretty quickly. And after that, I will give the COVID update, and then we got about $1.14 million in agriculture grants going out to some counties. We'll talk about that at the end and open it up to questions. Secretary Adams.
Thank you, Governor. I'll just make a brief statement and give you my own summary of the agreement, and then I'll stay until the Governor is done with the rest of his press conference, and I'm happy to take any questions that you all have here. I'll be available the rest of the day also for any other media. The Governor and I, we spent about a month going back and forth in stages. It was at all times a very professional and cordial exchange. He has principles. I have principles too. A lot of the time those principles are the same, sometimes they're different. But from the first moment, both he and I have put party aside completely and looked at the facts rationally with two goals. How do we make sure everyone's kept safe, and how do we make sure people aren't disenfranchised by this virus? That is what we did back in April for our June primary plan. It's what we did in July and August for November. I actually think that this agreement takes the best of what we did previously. It spots the kinks in what we did previously that in practice didn't work as well, and improves on what we had in the past. So when the Governor has said that he wanted to repeat what we did in June, I took that to mean let's take what worked and let's make it even better. Let's take what didn't work and let's fix that. And so that's what I've endeavored to do, and I believe that this agreement does exactly that. So just to reiterate real quickly the major parts of this plan. First off, okay, who gets to vote absentee? Kentucky law by statute already has about roughly a dozen exceptions for people. We are taking one of those exceptions and broadening it. Currently, a voter is able to vote absentee on the basis of age, disability, or illness, making that voter not able to vote at the polls in person. We've expanded that. That will include any voter of any age or health condition who believes he or she's at risk from COVID-19. You can vote absentee. If you're concerned about your health, you can vote absentee. You don't have to tell your county clerk or me or anyone else what your health condition is. We also don't ask your age. I didn't have in here any sort of arbitrary range of ages, 60, 55, whatever. There's no age limit. That's actually consistent with the current statute. It's the voter's subjective decision whether the voter is of an age or health condition that makes the risk unacceptable to that voter. We also have one degree of separation where that eligibility to vote absentee applies to voters who are in contact with these vulnerable populations. So again, we are not going to encourage everyone to vote by absentee ballot the way we did previously. That is based on a concern that is bipartisan that was raised by county clerks of both parties, by the State Board of Election staff of both parties, that we might overload our mail system, overload our county clerks, overload the Postal Service. That doesn't mean that we don't want people voting absentee. We do. We encourage them to do that if they are at risk. And again, that's a subjective decision on the part of the voter. Number two, I got a lot of feedback, if you want to call it that, about people voting absentee ballot in an expanded way for the first time in Kentucky history. The reviews were positive, negative, depending on maybe your politics, but here's one thing that everybody loved: in-person early voting. I didn't get a single negative feedback or comment from a county clerk in any county, a voter anywhere. We get a lot of feedback on our election system and no complaints on that. So we're actually expanding that. The goal here is to transition toward a more normal style of election. We're not going to have a traditional election with 98% of voters voting in person on election day. We just can't. We also can't have 75% of voters mailing in a ballot like we did in June. We can't have that either. This is going to be somewhere in the middle of that. And to make that feasible, we're going to have expanded in-person early voting. Starting October 13th, every clerk's office will be open, whether it's that clerk's office location or some other location, at least one location in the county for voters to come in during regular business hours and vote in person. We're also going to explicitly require in this agreement Saturdays be made available. This is really good for voter convenience, but more to the point for this plan, it's important to keep people spaced apart. Our polling sites can't handle everybody voting on election day in person, but we can handle some people mailing it in, some people using the drop box to drop an absentee ballot, some people using the early voting option in person, and some people using the election day option in person. Third, to talk about Senate Bill 2 for just a moment, I'm proud that I ran on, won on, helped write, helped pass Senate Bill 2, Kentucky's photo ID law. Now in Kentucky, you got to have a photo ID to vote as a general matter. But when this law was a campaign promise of mine, when it was drafted in the legislature in the early months of this year, it was before the pandemic. I actually asked for an exception in the bill. Wasn't able to get that at the last minute. So we've added one for the purposes of this election. Any person who's not able to get a photo ID due to COVID-19 will be able to vote with a non-photo ID. Before I was elected and before Senate Bill 2, that was the legal standard. A non-photo ID is sufficient. Now it's not going to be sufficient for the vast majority of voters. But if you can't get a photo ID through no fault of your own, because of the threat of coronavirus or because the government office you would like to go to get your photo ID has been closed due to the pandemic, either they're closed now or they've been closed for a while and now they're reopened, but there's a big backlog, there are lines. We're not going to expect you to go through that and get a photo ID. I'm proud of the fact that we've made IDs free to our poorer residents. It can change their lives getting a free ID from the state. It's a wonderful thing. On the other hand, if they can't get it, they shouldn't be expected to get it in order to vote. So we've lifted that. We've also lifted Senate Bill 2's requirement that you have a copy of your photo ID provided with your mail-in application for an absentee ballot. The portal makes that largely unnecessary because the portal, through an agreement between the Beshear administration and my administration, allows for the driver's license database to be linked into the portal so we can verify your identity that way. That's actually how we did it for the primary. So we're not going to expect people who are at risk to go out and vote to then take the same risk to go out and get an ID or go out and get a copy of a photo ID. So that's the relief that's in here for Senate Bill 2. Just very quickly, the governor said we're going to have a voting center, a super center in every county. Voters like having one central location where they could vote conveniently. It's an idea I actually had in permanent legislation I offered earlier this year before the pandemic. I think it's a good idea. It's something I want to bring back to the legislature next year. I don't want voters to only have a supercenter. I want them to have other precinct locations to go vote at. But we're going to have at least one place. This is for voter convenience. It's to enable social distancing. But here's another good benefit from that. I cannot tell you how many people every election are disenfranchised because they go to the wrong precinct to vote, and the poll worker doesn't let them vote. The law doesn't let them. You got to vote at your precinct. That's been our state law for a long time. With the supercenter model, you can go vote at the supercenter, and every precinct in that county can vote there. It's a good thing to have regardless of a pandemic. Another thing that we've addressed in here is the cure process. Kentucky law does not have a cure process for when a voter has a mismatch of his or her signature on an absentee ballot envelope versus the voter's signature of record on a driver's license or a voter registration card. The cure process enabled us, I don't have a hard count, but I know anecdotally of about 1,000 voters whose votes were counted who otherwise wouldn't have had their votes counted because we had a cure process built in for signature mismatches. We've expanded that cure process now to all sorts of voter error. We've had thousands of ballots in the state that were not counted due to voter error. It's no one's fault but the voters, but frankly, it's something that we want to avoid. The voter doesn't sign where the voter's supposed to sign, et cetera. So the cure process will actually take care of that. And we've specifically required the county clerks to take a highlighter and highlighter all the blanks that have to be signed by the voter. So my goal here is to have fewer spoiled ballots. You're going to have a greater risk of spoiled ballots with an absentee system than an election day system, because the poll worker can help a voter, give him a new ballot if he made a mistake. You can't get that as easily with absentee balloting, but we're going to do our best to fix that. And then the governor said we're going to have reduction of polling locations. It's inevitable. Not every location in our state's able to handle election day this time. A lot of our polling locations are churches or schools. Some of them are actually nursing homes. We're not going to have precinct voting in nursing homes this year. I don't know if we're going to have 3,000 voting locations, but we're not going to have 170, 180 as we did in June. I'm not sure what that number is in the middle, but here's what I can tell you. The governor and I were both very disappointed to see so many counties overly reduce their polling locations. Obviously, we heard a lot about Jefferson and Fayette, but it was a statewide issue. This time, the counties are empowered to reduce their locations based on need because they can't get locations or they can't get poll workers or both. But this time, those decisions are now subject to the review and the approval of the governor and the Secretary of State. Both he and I were held accountable for some of those counties' decisions. This time, we are going to be accountable because we're going to have the ability to approve or veto that. Very last point. The biggest complaint my office got about the last election, even though we got rave reviews in the state and across America, the biggest complaint was voting locations. I think we're going to fix that. In my office, we just launched a new portal this week to help us find volunteer poll workers. The same portal, govoteky.com, that will open soon for your absentee ballot requests, is also available now to register to vote and to volunteer to be a poll worker. But the second biggest complaint that I got was about it taking a week for us to find out who won the elections. The voters of both parties don't like that. I don't like that either. The candidates really hate it. We wanted a faster count. So we've made a couple of changes here. Here's the big one. This time we're explicitly requiring all the counties to report all their votes received on election night. We are allowing votes to come in if they've been postmarked as of election day. We'll allow a few more days for those to come in, so the results on election night won't be final, but they never are. They're always unofficial results. But I expect that we'll have the vast majority of the vote in. We'll have all the early in person, we'll have all the election day in person, and we'll have most of the absentee votes in as of election day. And under this agreement, those will all be counted, those will all be tallied, those will all be publicly reported. So I believe we're going to have not just the things that worked so well in June, that I'm so proud of, and I know the governor is as well, but improvements to the things that people didn't like as much. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'll stick around for any questions you may have. Thank you so much.
All right, we're going to quickly give today's COVID update, then one other piece of news, and we'll open it up to questions, which I imagine will be largely on today's election announcement. So today we continue to see high numbers of COVID cases, certainly not as high as a couple days ago. But it does look like by the end of this week we will have more cases that we will report than last week. While I don't believe that number will be more than 10% more, it does show that at best we are at a plateau thanks to people's wearing of facial coverings, and we still need more time to reach a decline, which will result in a decline in our positivity rate to get this state in the place that we really need to be to do so many activities that we want. Now, if we are as close at the end of the week as I think that we will be, it will be, at this point, compelling evidence that we have, at least for the time being, prevented that escalation and reached a new plateau, though one that is higher than we would like. So today we're confirming 679 new cases of COVID-19. We are always going back and improving the data, so after removal of duplicates, our total state case count is now 38,298. Today we have 656 Kentuckians in the hospital for COVID-19, 147 in the ICU, 97 we need to be praying for that are on a ventilator, including one of my friends in northern Kentucky. We have a 5.68% positivity rate. I'm glad that is below 6, which we only reached for a couple of days, but we have got to get that lower. Certainly the White House even said for regular reopening, we need to get that number under 5%, and those are their doctors giving their opinion, not just ours. Today's numbers include 77 kids under 18. When we talk about what we are seeing, an explosion of younger people, school-age kids, 77 under 18 is pretty significant in 679 total cases. They include 3 school-age children in Barron County, one that would have been in middle school, 2 that'd be in high school by age, that presumably would have started in the schools if they go ahead with their current plans instead of doing distance learning until we can get this thing under control and open up at a time when I believe that we can do it successfully in September. Today's report also includes another 3 school-age children in Hardin County. So with the 6 yesterday, that's 9 in the last 2 days. Again, it would be positive, and at this point could potentially be spreading inside of a school. Today's new cases by county: Jefferson 193, Fayette 44, Lewis 30. Shows how quickly this can jump up and grow in a state. Warren County 30. They've continued to be in double digits just about every day for the last several months. Hardin County 26, Madison 21, Barron County 18. Barron County, especially for the population, has had significant cases over the last several weeks. Kenton County 18, Boone County 17, Harlan 14, Clark 12, Bullitt 10, Laurel 10, Pulaski 10. So again, we are seeing significant increases in our school-age children, and I hope that makes everybody pause. Commit to not experimenting with our kids. Make sure we are learning best practices from other people making mistakes so that we don't make them with them. In my core, I want to get our kids back in class. I want to get my kids back in class. My job is to tell people when I don't believe it's safe, even if it's unpopular and even if it makes people call you names. It is my job to make sure I do the very best I can for Kentuckians. And I hope that schools that are going to make different decisions, whether private or public, are going to be honest about clusters or cases that they have once they start, but also ones they've had over the past several weeks or several months. I think it's critically important that parents with kids coming back know the experience that schools have been having. Today, we're also reporting 8 new deaths: an 83-year-old woman in Jefferson, an 85-year-old woman in Bell. They're all women today. An 82-year-old woman in Franklin, a 92-year-old woman in Franklin, an 85-year-old woman in Casey, a 75-year-old woman in Hopkins, a 77-year-old woman in Lewis, and a 63-year-old woman in County. Those are most likely moms, grandmoms, sisters that people have lost, aunts, loved ones. So let's make sure that for them, we are strong. We light those green lights. We ring the bells every day at 10 a.m. One other piece of information, and on Monday we'll go back to the full report with long-term care. A little bit of good news. A little bit of dollars going into our agriculture communities to help them grow, to promote what we're looking at, a sophisticated agriculture and agri-tech economy in Kentucky that is so important, especially with what we have seen during COVID-19 and the hit on our food chain. This is an area where we can lead the country, but we got to be innovative. We can't just do things the way we've always done them and think the way that we've always done. This is an area where the next breakthroughs are going to be as important as in any other industry. So today we've got loans going out to approved projects. These are 7 projects. There's more details in our release. They're exciting. They're going to Harrison County of $143,000, Trigg County $150,000, Clinton County $250,000 going into Clinton County. That's exciting. Hardin County making out like a bandit today in these with a little over $300,000, Madison $135,000, and Taylor $201,000. At a time when we're worried about our economy, where we're seeing short-term record unemployment, these are the type of investments where we're not just playing catch-up. We are creating an industry, fostering the new ideas that can employ so many people moving forward. When we come out of COVID, I just don't want to walk. I want to run towards a brighter future, and the investments we make right now are what's going to get us there. All right, so we've done that pretty quickly. We'll open it up to questions. If you'll just let us know whether you're asking for me or the Secretary of State, we will get them answered for you. So, Shelby, you want to kick us off? The other person's always more popular.
Can you give us an update on how poll worker recruitment is going and what your goal is?
Well, my goal is 15,000. That's a pretty high goal. That's what it takes in a normal election. We've got nearly 4,000 precincts across our state. Each one takes 4 poll workers. I'm learning how to do this. The question was, how's it going with poll worker recruitment? Here's the answer. So I would like to have 15,000 poll workers if we can. It takes that many to have a traditional election. But the fact is, most of our poll workers, the average age is retirement age. The people that we're trying the hardest to protect, because they're most at risk, not just from catching it, but from premature demise, those are the people who typically we ask to go work the polls. I testified to the legislature last year before I was inaugurated that we have a poll worker crisis in our state. We've got the greatest generation that's a very civic and service-minded generation, and they're aging out of being poll workers, and they're not being replaced. The younger generations, my generation, Generation X, we're not stepping up enough. We need that service mentality among Gen X, baby boomers, millennials, and so forth to replace our retiring poll workers. So it's going to take 15,000 to open up every location. As I said earlier, I don't know that we're going to have every location open. I'm not sure that that's feasible because some of them are nursing homes and so forth, but I want as many as we can possibly have. I've actually been lobbied this week by the counties saying we want to open up all our locations. That's great with me if we can get the locations and we can get the poll workers. As I said, my office opened up a portal this week. We've already gotten nearly 1,000 volunteers. That's great. But that's a drop in the bucket of what we need. It's only August. We've got plenty of time. I'm very confident that Kentuckians will step up. People are looking for a way to give back, and I appreciate that, and this is a great way to help. I am hopeful that we'll have as many open as we possibly can.
This is in regards to the United States Postal Office is saying they have concerns with the speed of mail and if they'll be able to actually get ballots in time, especially with, an increased. Is there some type of contingency plan in place if we do see a major slowdown of mail?
Did you want that one, Governor? Just kidding. The question was at the post office. I communicated to the governor my concerns about the Postal Service. I'm not going to knock the Postal Service. They do a heck of a job with really difficult circumstances. But the fact is, they've got a hard job to do, and every industry, every organization, public and private, has been impacted by COVID-19. I understand that a letter has gone out to 46 states, a warning from the Postal Service that they're concerned about timely delivery of election mail. I haven't got that letter. Maybe it's in the mail somewhere. I haven't got it yet, but I've seen it in the media. Let me tell you what this plan does about that. I've always assumed that this was a potential danger. I'm not aware that we had a big problem in the primary, but I will tell you this. In 2018, the Inspector General of the Postal Service issued an audit report, and they looked at the midterm elections in 2018. And what they found was the goal, the publicly stated goal of the Postal Service, was to deliver 96% of election mail. They would give themselves an A if they misplaced only 4% of election mail or delivered it too late to be counted. That's not enough. That's just not good enough. And that goal wasn't even met. And that was one of my issues with an over-reliance on the three-legged stool of the leg of absentee voting. We've got a three-legged stool on this plan: absentee voting for those who need it, early voting in person, and election day voting in person with more locations. If you put too much pressure on any one leg of that stool, then the stool snaps. So what we did is, number one, we've got a lesser reliance on that part of the system. Number two, we're going to have more drop boxes available than we did in the primary. We're going to buy a whole other round of them and give them out to the counties. The other thing that we did is we are going to open the portal much, much earlier. It wasn't by design, but COVID broke late enough in the primary process that even with a delay of 5 weeks, we were really scurrying to change the rules and put a process in place to respond to the pandemic. We opened up the portal, I think it was May 22nd. Election day was June 23rd. That meant that we had to get that thing up as soon as possible, and we only had a few weeks to run it, and then it closed a week before the election. And then the poor county clerks were trying to get out of the deluge of requests at the same time they're opening up early voting. It was not ideal. So this time we're going to open up the portal much, much earlier. We're going to open the portal essentially mid-August, within the next week. We're also going to close it earlier. Voters are going to have far more time, about twice as long, to go online to govoteky.com and apply for their absentee ballot. But we're going to close it a little earlier this time. That lets the county clerks get out of the deluge of getting the ballots processed and then move on without missing a beat to the expanded in-person early voting. But I won't speak for the governor. I believe, though, we're on the same page on this. We're going to encourage voters to get those ballots back in as soon as they make up their minds. Look, if you're taking your time, no pressure. But if you know who you're going to vote for, go ahead and get it back. Get it back, because the sooner you get it and the sooner that you send it back to us, the sooner that we can process it, and the sooner it can be counted. That way it can be counted in the election night totals and not days later. I don't want us to be like New York or other states that are going to wait weeks. They're still counting votes were just finished from New York, and they had about 6 times a higher proportion of spoiled ballots than we do. I think we can do a better job than New York has done, and I think these elements of the plan will help assure that. So the question was, do I think I'm going to face blowback because of elements of this plan? I don't know. I had a really big blowback back in June, but I will tell you this. Once I was able to explain to Republicans that we had anti-fraud provisions in all of this, that we verified identity before we sent out an absentee ballot, that we verified signatures of the voter, once we laid out all the protocols we had to ensure a safe and secure election, a lot of objection died off. And ultimately, most Republicans voted absentee in June. I never would have believed that in a million years back in April when I was getting torn up, that Republicans would vote absentee, but they did. So I'm hopeful that by leaving Senate Bill 2 intact and not suspending it entirely, but also being humane and addressing the concerns that came up after the bill was drafted, I think that's a good compromise. I think the vast majority of voters are going to be asked for a photo ID and have to provide it. So I think it's a good compromise. Frankly, if I hadn't made it, the law might have been struck down. And I want to keep this on the books. So I think it's a good compromise.
And then we'll keep going through and come back. Real quickly on the post office question, if we undermine the Postal Service, we crush rural communities. It's not just about this election, which I know is what we're thinking about, but our rural communities so depend on the post office in ways that many people who live in larger cities can never feel. It's absolutely critical that we get out of any, whether it's an attempt to undermine or a lack of funding or the rest, and support the post office, because for most counties in Kentucky, we can't survive without it. About the blowback thing, listen, I think he's doing the right thing. And I think voters understand that in the middle of a pandemic. Lawrence?
Can you talk about the process for getting approval for reducing the number of election sites? What will the process be?
The process that has been recommended and put into the executive order is you have to do it by application, submit your plan. It's reviewed by 3 different entities, the Board of Election, the Secretary of State, and myself. We're all just looking for reasonableness. You know, only one polling location. What's the logic in where you're putting them? Are underserved populations, one that don't have access to transportation? Are there enough polling places there? I think to me, it's going to be one of reasonableness. Everybody understands you can't have all of them in the middle of a pandemic. We can't. But the question is, how much has the burden been increased, and has it been increased too much on those that have a challenge in meeting that increase? But this gives you so many different ways to vote, and to vote early, and I believe the campaigns that do the get out the vote now have plenty of time and clarity about how to message, and whether it's provide rides or the rest. You can provide rides to a super center. You can provide rides on election day. So I think getting this done and the timing that we have is going to be really helpful.
If the portal to request an absentee ballot, that's up next week after, I assume, the state board has a sign off. How will the excuse process work? Will it be like a checkbox, or will it have to type something in? How exactly is that going to work?
So the question was, how does the excuse process work for voters voting absentee? Did I get that right? So we're going to use the portal again. That was another thing that voters, I found, regardless of their politics, really liked, was just the convenience of the portal. Under Kentucky law, a voter can request an absentee ballot by email, by mail, by fax, or by visiting the clerk's office. The portal makes it even easier. I'd like to make it permanent. The way the portal was designed previously was the voter did not have to pick a particular subsection of the statute, a particular excuse within the code, and specify. It was just assumed that the reason was COVID-19. It was functionally no excuse. We're going to work on the portal in the next week. I've had these conversations with the State Board of Elections staff about working that out. We're going to have this available on there. Whether it's going to be a default or a drop down, we'll figure that out. But it will be very clear and very easy to use.
For those that don't have the photo ID on election day that need to sign the document, will that happen on election day, or do they need to plan in advance to sign the document?
Well, as I said, most of the law is intact, and if a voter comes under the law before this plan, for that matter, if a voter comes to vote, the voter is asked for a photo ID. What I found was, before this law existed, was that a lot of clerks did ask for a photo ID, and then some didn't, and then you had disparate treatment, which is I don't think constitutional. So the process will be the voters ask for a photo ID. Hopefully the voter has one. If the voter does not, then one of two things happens. If the voter has a photo ID not on his or her person, can vote what's called a provisional ballot. They don't have to leave and go home and then come back. They can go ahead and vote, but that vote is isolated into a separate box called a provisional ballot box. That's federal law. That's been around since about 2002. We'll comply with that. If the voter does not have one, does not own a photo ID, the voter can still vote, but the voter needs a non-photo ID and then needs to sign an oath of voter and state a reasonable impediment exists that prevents that voter from voting with a photo ID. And there are various ones laid out in the statute. One of them is disability or illness. And what this plan does is it expands the definition of disability or illness to include COVID-19, whether it's COVID-19 directly being a threat to the voter going out to get an ID, or whether it's an indirect effect of the voter not being able to get an ID because COVID-19's closed down the circuit clerk's office.
You just have to determine where those locations will be. Is it going to be in that like super center or whatever?
That will be a county decision. What we saw so the question is about where's the early voting locations. The counties will decide those. In some counties, the clerk used the clerk's office. Actually, we have early voting in Kentucky. It's somewhat discretionary how long it lasts, but it's only designed by law for absentee voters. You vote there early if you're going to be out of town on Election Day. This is going to be no excuse early voting. You don't have to be out of town. You can do it whenever. But the locations are TBD. What the clerks did for June is that some of them use their clerk's offices. That's what they've always done. But some of the clerk's offices were not amenable to social distancing, so they picked other locations. It'll be up to them. We really had speaking for myself, no complaints about the locations for early voting. In fact, I think looking back in retrospect, I wish that maybe I'd done a better job informing voters about early voting opportunities. We had more people vote on Election Day than we had vote in the 2 weeks before Election Day in June. I would have liked to have seen more people vote early, and we would have had not the long lines we had in Fayette County.
A couple of written questions, and then we'll get the last couple.
Have I talked with any private, parochial, or public school administrators, especially today, in an effort to get them to wait until September 28th? The Department of Education is having those calls with each and every district that is considering starting earlier. I think some are listening to reason about trying to make sure that we are not the experiment and seeing some of the real concerns that are going on in other states, and the fact that, Lord, I hope that we are at the very peak of this virus, but at the peak we are seeing a lot of kids that would otherwise be walking into a school right now or on Monday or on Tuesday. And we've even got a lot of sports teams of these or other schools that have had an outbreak during the summer that show that this thing is just in a tough place. I've made the recommendation. I think people see or should see that it's genuine. I love my kids being in class. I want to get them back there. But my job is to make the best recommendation to protect my kids and everybody else's. Lawrence?
In these days of sharply divided politics, people might be surprised to see a Republican and Democrat come together and agree on something like this. How did it happen?
I want to give a lot of credit to the Secretary of State. When you start off with a really good product, it makes it a lot easier to reach an agreement. But I don't think we had one partisan conversation either for the June election or for this one. It may be that it's based on mutual respect. We didn't even really horse trade in it. It's just recognizing the pandemic that we face and trying to do the right thing. When you don't spend time throwing barbs at each other at different times, it makes it a lot easier to get together and to do that. But I'll let the Secretary respond to that if you want to.
Yeah, just really fast. The governor and I had some things to work out, but they were actually fairly technical. They really weren't about big picture ideological differences, let alone partisan differences. We had the same goals. How do we keep people safe, and how do we ensure no one's disenfranchised? And that's what it really came down to. We're both attorneys. We looked at this like attorneys, objectively, dispassionately, no pounding on the table, that sort of thing. This is complicated technical stuff, and so it took some time to work out some things and get it right, but it's a great product for both sides. And just one quick point. I think the fact that it took a while to do this and that it wasn't achieved until mid-August, that's a good thing. Because I want both sides to see that they've got a Democratic governor and a Republican Secretary of State agreeing. If this were just the Beshear plan or just the Adams plan, half the public wouldn't accept it. And if there's any part of our system that has got to be seen as fair and neutral and objective. It's the election system. We cannot have people thinking the system is rigged. There are always going to be people on the far left or the far right that have conspiracy theories about the government trying to suppress people or have vote fraud. This proves it's nonsense. I think 80% of voters will probably accept this with aplomb. They're going to get to vote with options the way they prefer to vote.
Are either of you concerned that while there is an excuse to request an absentee ballot, it's pretty broad and it's subjective to the voter themselves, are you concerned at all that 75% again might try to vote through absentee mail and the mail system might not be able to process it?
Based on the time, the question is, do we have concerns that so many people will vote absentee that the mail process, or I guess the clerks on the other end, will have a hard time processing it? I believe that the system, it's set up to give a lot of options. If people overwhelmingly choose to vote by mail, it's set up to get them to do it early, and for these things to start coming in October, and to make sure, even in September, and to make sure that they can be counted early. I'm also willing to look at assistance from the National Guard for our clerks if we are seeing those numbers come in at that high of a rate. We did it in the primary. We'd be willing to do it again. I believe that the Postal Service can handle this. I've always had faith in the Postal Service. While there are some worries right now, I think a lot of it is just caught up in national politics. And again, I'll tell you, the fastest way to upset rural America and to make the systems that it relies upon fail is to undermine the Postal Service. This is something that ought to be fixed and ought not to be a football, moving forward at all. But I have confidence that we can handle it, and that I have additional authority to bring in extra folks to help.
One thing I think the governor and I always agreed on is there's nothing wrong with having 750,000 or 800,000 absentee ballots. That's a good thing. It's keeping people safe. The problem is if you scale that up for a general election turnout, it gets pretty dicey, and you can see people disenfranchised, whether it's through postal delays or just the risk of voter error because absentee is new to a lot of people. You've got people voting in November this year who haven't voted in 4 years. You've got some voters who only vote once every 4 years. What they care about is who the president is. They vote in the presidential general election, and they're not aware of changes. They've never voted absentee. They haven't followed all the stuff necessarily that we've done for June. And so those are potentially some low information people on either side of the spectrum who are faced with a different approach, and it confuses them, and you're looking at voter error. So that's part of why my recommendation to the governor this week was that we maintain that for people who need it, and we encourage them to use it, but we not put all the eggs in that one basket if we can avoid that. Here's one big difference, I think, in practice more than in substance that will make a difference that's good. Last time, as I said, the governor and I were on the same page encouraging people to please, if you could, vote absentee. Please don't vote in person unless you need to. If you do, we get it. We're going to have early voting for you. We're going to have in-person voting for you on Election Day. But we still encourage them to vote absentee. And that's why we had 75% absentee. Another reason is we had so few voting locations. People were pushed into voting that way. And it was an option, which is a good thing, but people felt like they were being pushed into an option they didn't actually want. They wanted to vote in person. What's so great about this agreement is the options are actually, even more the case, real options. It's the same options we had in June, except now you're not forced into voting absentee if you don't want to because your polling site is closed. You're going to have more in-person opportunities with more early voting days, and also you're going to have more sites on Election Day.
All right, we want to thank everybody for coming. I think that this is a big win for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. More options to vote in this election than ever before, and I think an agreement, a bipartisan agreement about how we can do this safely. We can enfranchise every Kentuckian that can currently vote under law, and that we have the option for a great, safe election. Thank you all very much.